Over the course of the 21st century thus far, we have seen a profound reconfiguration of the political and ideological landscapes of the modern world. The ever-ongoing cultural dialogue has begun to shift ever more rapidly than has ever before been the case throughout the entire course of modernity, as information technologies have come to radically transform the ways in which ideas are disseminated, framed, and contextualized. I really cannot emphasize enough the degree to which the territories dividing the left and right poles of the cultural spectrum have shifted since I initially came to an awareness of cultural issues during the early years of the Bush administration, the era of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. A vast range of political opinions, which were once considered to be firmly within the domain of the political left, are now commonly regarded as trademarks of the so-called far right. Attitudes towards vaccine policies, for example, are but one striking instance of this trend among many others. A myriad of factors have contributed to this reconstruction of the cultural divide, and I won't be attempting to present an overall breakdown of that topic in this video. In general, however, it seems to me that we are living in a time period in which the left-right polarity itself is rapidly becoming less and less coherent with each passing year, if not month or even week. The cultural zeitgeist of Western neoliberalism, which has prevailed since the end of the Second World War, seems to be rapidly morphing into something else, at least at a cultural level, if not a geopolitical one. Amidst the breakdown of this zeitgeist, a number of political tribes have begun to emerge. Within more intellectual online spaces, for example, various forms of accelerationist ideologies have begun to rise to prominence. Simultaneously, we have seen leftist ideologies make a sharp turn away from Marxist philosophies and more towards libertine forms of post-structuralism, which have derived influence largely from the academic culture of France, which prevailed during the 1960s and 1970s. In this video, we are going to be looking primarily at the ideological framework of radical traditionalism, which is also sometimes referred to as the rad-trad movement. Among the various ideological camps which have germinated in online spaces in recent years, this radical traditionalism is that which is most closely associated with my own conceptual framework, at least in terms of underlying metaphysics. There are significant distinctions to be made, however, and as such, this discussion will hopefully not only serve as an explication and examination of the rad-trad ideology, but can also serve as a means of more clearly articulating some of the nuances of my own perspective on cultural and political issues. In most general terms, radical traditionalism can be understood as an outright rejection of modernity, and tends to see the entire developmental trajectory of modern history as a process of degeneration. Contemporary rad-trads tend to derive influence from thinkers such as René Guénon and Julius Evola, who developed extensive and often vicious critiques of modern culture, economics, ideological presumptions, and political organization. Rad-trad thinkers tend to emphasize that human beings are necessarily socio-political and cultural organisms, and firmly reject the individualistic atomism of liberalist ideologies. Liberalism, which has served as the central backbone of modernity over the course of the past 2.5 centuries, regards human societies in terms of a social contract, an agreement between the nation's citizens who are regarded as the basic units of rationalistic individualism. Liberal thinkers thus regard the laws and norms of a society as a kind of rationalistic project, which is undertaken through a kind of negotiation between an array of individual human egos, which must balance their interests against one another in reaching a communal compromise, within which all such individuals come to benefit overall. Rad-trads, conversely, see this so-called social contract as a mere abstraction, which obfuscates the reality of human social organization. Radtrads instead argue, correctly in my opinion, that the social contract is in fact a fantasy which has been contrived specifically to justify a restructuring of societies so as to benefit a minority of power-hungry, mercantile actors. These profiteers have developed and employed liberal ideologies to facilitate the corrosion of social cohesion, which they themselves are able to benefit from, to the detriment of society at large. Radical traditionalists, as with myself, see society not as a quasi-entrepreneurial business contract between atomic rational agents, but rather as a kind of superorganism. Traditions, values, institutions, and spiritual practices are not merely conventions which are agreed upon by rational negotiations, but rather are the organ systems of the societal superorganism. The reconfiguration of these organ systems under the guise of rationalistic progress is therefore a facade, which allows profit-driven and sociopathic actors to dismember the societal organism and consequently to dismember the human spirit itself in the service of their own egotistical aims. Just as radtrads do not see society as a rationally constructed machine, they likewise do not see the human self as an atomic, autonomous, and disembodied agency, as is implied by liberal ideology. Human beings are not seen to be simply endowed with rationality, agency, and moral conscience in an automatic manner. Rather, the human self must be understood as an organ which is socialized into being. Spiritual practices, myths, and conceptions of sacredness are thus much more than a mere aesthetic fluff which rides on top of a more fundamental substrate of more tangible economic and legal structures. These metaphysical institutions are understood to be absolutely fundamental within the process of human ego development, and the development of the moral orientation which an individual requires in order to actually become the rational agent which liberal ideology presumes the human being to be. Here we must also understand that liberalism itself was developed in a world that almost universally presumed a background of such social organ systems. Specifically, that presumed background was Christianity. Within the post-World War II zeitgeist we currently inhabit, it has become increasingly common to presume that social, scientific, and technological progress can and should result in the dissolution of metaphysically laden social organs such as religious institutions, spiritual practices, and supernatural beliefs. Some radical materialists have even gone so far as to suggest that philosophy itself will eventually come to be supplanted by mechanistic, procedural scientific reductionism. The founding fathers of liberalism, however, would have seen such hubristic progressivism to be utterly absurd, as such thinkers saw that the individual agency and rationality required by liberalism needed to be cultivated by the social processes of the Christian life world. Following World War II, however, these social processes increasingly came to be dismembered by the advance of neoliberalism. The ideal of a mutual arrangement between rational agents has itself come to be supplanted by the ideal of progress achieved by social engineering, which is administered by a quasi-intellectual bureaucracy. The social organs which condition the possibility of rational, independent human individuality have come to be almost entirely replaced by artificial processes which are instead oriented towards infantilizing the human psyche and deforming the natural development of the human ego. Liberalism, in other words, has already destroyed itself, and this self-destruction was not accidental. It was driven by the exact same interests, which initially employed liberal ideologies as a means of breaking down the monarchist and aristocratic social systems which stood in the way of the ascending capitalist kleptocracy during the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Radical traditionalists are quite correct, I would argue, in seeing that the process of modernity, and particularly the evolution of this process over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries has largely been one of social and psychological disintegration. This, however, must lead us to ask, why has this process occurred, what has driven it, and what is the logical end point of this process? It is here that radtrads tend to gesture towards the writings of the German theoretical historian Oswald Spengler. Unlike other theoretical historians who have attempted to understand the processions of history in terms of crude superficialities, such as economic systems, technological developments, or military engagements, Spengler saw history in a definitively organismic manner. Spengler drew influence from Johann von Goethe's conceptions of organicity, specifically from Goethe's notion of the Urphänomen, a central archetypal motif which serves as a kind of center of developmental gravity, which conditions the morphogenesis of living systems. Rather than seeing living beings as quasi-mechanistic contrivances, Goethe saw that the entirety of an organism must be understood in relation to an overarching morphological coherence. Organisms are the expressions of a kind of archetypal logic, within which every part is in some way an elaboration or unfolding of a core motif, such that all morphological elements are seen to condition one another through their mutual participation in a holistic unity. Biologists of the 18th century had come to believe that although the human skeleton shares in a common morphology with that of other mammals, there was one particular bone found in other mammals which the human skeleton seemed to lack. At the time, this bone was referred to as the intermaxillary bone, now commonly referred to as the premaxillary bone. Within virtually all mammal species, this bone, found within the skull, serves as a support for the organism's snout. As this bone seemed to be absent in the human skull, 18th century biologists concluded that it was this bone which differentiated human physiology from other living creatures. This single, inconspicuous bone was taken as signifying that human beings are more than merely animals. Johann von Goethe, however, saw this conclusion as utterly unacceptable, as he saw that skeletal morphology is not merely an aggregation of functional parts, but rather an expression of an underlying holistic coherence. Goethe intuited that the premaxillary bone might be absent in adult human skeletons, but might instead be found within the skeletons of infants, before the bone would come to conceal itself by fusing into the other bones of the human skull. As subsequent investigations would come to reveal, Goethe was completely correct in his presumption. We should take note of the fact that Goethe had no experimental data or mathematical models which informed his prediction here. Seen from the perspective of modern, degenerate science, it would seem that Goethe was simply acting upon a guess. The reality, however, is that Goethe was able to see that the presumptions of his fellow biologists failed to account for the inner logic of organicity itself, and thus of nature itself. Nature cannot simply remove a bone from the skeletal structure, as each bone is only what it is insofar as it participates in a holistic composition which implies all of the other bones. If one removes a color from the rainbow or removes a line from a poem, then the whole ceases to be what it is, as the existence of each element is ontologically conditioned by its relationships to the other elements. Just as Thomas Kuhn would come to lay the groundwork for such a morphogenetic understanding of scientific paradigms, Oswald Spengler would similarly come to develop a morphogenetic understanding of human civilizations, and thus of human history. Spengler saw each human civilization as a distinct organism, which is delineated by a certain form language, a living complex of meaning, symbolism, practices, myths, and valuative hierarchies which renders the world itself comprehensible and navigable. Each form language is a horizon of meanings, within which human life is able to effectively orient itself towards its own sustenance and reproduction. The core of such a form language is then what Spengler referred to as an Ur-symbol. the primordial form or phenomenon of a given civilization, which all other morphological aspects of the civilization are elaborations of. Accompanying the or symbol, we also find the or myth of a civilization, the most basic narrative pattern, which serves as the central germ of the mode of human consciousness which the civilization comes to unfold. As with biological organisms, these societal organisms proceed through distinct phases of organic life cycles. Each civilization proceeds through its own spring, summer, fall, and winter, just as biological creatures proceed through phases of infancy, adolescence, adulthood, and senescence. Looking to what we typically refer to as Western civilization, Spengler saw what he would refer to as Faustian civilization, a form language which has developed from a central or myth which Spengler saw as the myth of Dr. Faustus and Mephistopheles. Appropriately, it was this Faustian myth which Goethe himself had obsessively rendered as an epic tragedy which many regard as his magnum opus. Spengler thus saw the central myth of Faustian civilization as the Faustian bargain. Within this myth, the demon Mephistopheles makes a wager with God, betting that he can use his powers over the earthly realm to lure God's favorite human, the scholar Heinrich Faust, away from the righteous path and into the service of Satan. Faust is a man who has dedicated himself to garnering knowledge about the world, but who has come to feel that in doing so, he has denied himself the joys and adventures of actually living and experiencing the world. Faust summons the demon Mephistopheles, and the two agree to a pact. Mephistopheles will grant Faust's wishes, and if Faust is thereby able to attain a state of pure transcendental bliss that he no longer wishes to move on from, one which he could remain within for eternity, then Faust will concede his soul to Mephistopheles and serve him in the afterlife. Faust is a man who has achieved immense knowledge through his pious pursuit of the transcendent, but who has become disillusioned by this quest, and who has therefore come to use his erudite knowledge in order to attain worldly power. Within Faust, we can therefore see a microcosmic rendition of the Faustian bargain, which Western civilization itself can be seen to have partaken in. Medieval Christian Hermeticism and alchemy were fundamentally spiritual pursuits which would eventually be transfigured into the techno-scientific enterprise of achieving mastery over nature. Applying this perspective to the current state of modernity, radical traditionalists see the decadence of contemporary culture as the final death rattles of a Faustian project which has finally come to reach its own ultimate tragic endpoint. This perspective is certainly rather pessimistic in many respects. Civilizations are seen to rise, corrode, and collapse in phases which are ultimately deterministic and invariant. The situation we currently find ourselves within is one in which the Faustian project has already long outlived what should have been its natural death. Yet, rather than collapsing and thus becoming the soil from which a new culture form might emerge, Faustian civilization has utilized its own techno-economic infrastructure to maintain itself in what amounts to a state of suspended animation. Far worse than living within the decaying corpse of a dead life world, we are instead living within a world which is now effectively undead. A zombified, vampiric parody of what Christendom once aspired to be. Within the rad-trad framework, modern history, and perhaps even history itself, is seen to be a fundamentally degenerative process. Although all civilizations eventually come to undergo death and decay, our current situation is in many ways far more acute than what has been seen in the past due to the corrupting, world-unraveling power of the Faustian bargain. The values of modernity are seen to be, in fact, pseudo-values, to be an inverted, perverted parody of the moral imperatives which had previously served as the very fabric and lifeblood of Western civilization. What radical traditionalists call for, then, is a return to the traditions, norms, values, and institutions of the pre-modern world, such that we might begin to cultivate the germs of a truly living civilization which might come to grow out of the Faustian civilization's rapidly disintegrating remains. As such, these rad trads typically call for a return to the metaphysical and valuative structures of Platonism and Christianity, but it is here that we can begin to see the inexorable inner friction within the radical traditionalist ideology. In order to see clearly into the core of these processes, we must look closely at the dynamics which came to produce the Faustian bargain itself, and contextualize this bargain within the overall trajectory of history as a whole. The enterprise of the techno-scientific domination of nature is one which has, throughout the entire course of human history, emerged within exactly one cultural context, that of Western European Christendom. Here we must then ask, how and why did this particular development of human consciousness come to emerge in this way, and how can we see this development as an intrinsic element of a holistic morphology? How, in other words, might we see the life cycle of Faustian civilization as an organ of the organism that is human history? We must begin here with the polarity which we find along the axis of Eastern and Western civilizations. It is along this polarity that we see exemplifications of the two primary morphological motifs of human societal organization, which have predominated throughout all of recorded human history. Here what we find is a distinction of emphasis, which is expressed throughout all political, cultural, religious, and psychological dimensions of human life. In order to understand these distinctions, we must be able to see through the superficial manifestations of norms, institutions, and beliefs, and into the deeper morphological archetypes which give rise to such manifestations. The distinction which is most central to the East-West polarity is that which we find within the human experience of selfhood. We can understand the human self to be constituted by two primary aspects, which here I will be referring to as the solar self and the lunar self. These two archetypal images, the sun and moon, will allow us to begin to see the underlying principles which have given rise to the distinctions between the Western and Eastern worlds. The solar self is the self which is experienced as distinct from the world and from other human beings. It is the sense of self as something which is separate and individualistic, which is characterized by an autonomous agency, identity, intellect, and personal subjectivity. The solar self is, in other words, the egoic sense of selfhood, which comes to emerge through the process which Carl Jung referred to as individuation, and which Joseph Campbell depicted as the myth cycle, monomyth, or hero's journey. This process of individuation is one in which the individual comes to be separated from the interdependencies of the family, home, or tribe, and thus comes to be forced to develop a sense of individuality, self-efficacy, and independence in order to contend with the trials which it is faced with. While the moon reflects the light of the sun itself casts its own light. Much like this self-radiance of the sun, the solar self is a consciousness which is experienced as existing independently from its particular interrelations with the world around it. The archetypal hero can extricate himself from his social relations and move on to a completely different relational context while still remaining who he is. The lunar self, on the other hand, is a fundamentally relational sense of selfhood. The moon is archetypally associated with parenthood, childbirth, kinship relations, and the metabolic relationships, which weave together social wholes from separate individuals. One can go be a hero for another group of people, but parenthood simply doesn't operate in this way. If you are a mother, for example, then your identity as a mother relates specifically to your own child. One cannot be a mother in general or in abstraction, such that one could simply pack up one's motherhood and resituate it within a completely different social context consisting of completely different individuals. The solar self is therefore the sense of self as a kind of transcendental object, as a kind of form or eidos, which weaves together the human life into a unity and which delineates the self from others. The lunar self is then the relational self, a selfhood which is defined in relation to immanent, vital, metabolic relationships between the self and others. The developmental processes of human consciousness can be understood as a kind of balancing and dynamic interplay between these two dimensions of human identity. Looking to the differences between Western and Eastern civilizations, then, what we find is a difference in emphasis between these two aspects of human selfhood, which come to manifest in various ways across all dimensions of human life. Within Chinese culture, we see that the symbol of the Chinese form language, the Taijitu, symbolically gestures towards the form of the moon and to lunar cycles. During the Age of Sail, China had no interest in the solar gold offered by Western traders and insisted upon only accepting lunar silver as payment, as the Chinese saw silver as of much greater value than gold. Within Chinese mythology, we see a distinctly ambivalent attitude towards the solar aspects of human selfhood, exemplified within the mythology of Sun Wukong. Sun Wukong, otherwise known as the Monkey King, is a deity-like mythical figure who is associated with the sun, and who also exemplifies many characteristics of the trickster archetype, as is often the case with monkeys in Eastern mythologies. Sun Wukong achieves immense supernatural powers through Taoist practices. Wukong proceeds to rebel against the order of heaven, causing immense chaos and ultimately resulting in Wukong being imprisoned in a mountain, representing the solid Saturnian structures of established social order for 500 years. Upon being released from his imprisonment, Wukong evidently learns his lesson and endeavors upon a journey to learn the ways of Chinese Buddhism, through which Wukong comes to cultivate patience and humility. Wukong's mythos therefore shows us that the individualism and independence of the solar self is seen to be highly problematic within Chinese culture. Wukong's rebelliousness and chaotic nature make him a menace, and he is ultimately redeemed through becoming pacified by disciplinary norms. As we look to more Western cultures, we see a very different kind of relationship towards the solar sense of selfhood. Across the entire scope of the Western cultural mythos, we see a tendency towards emphasizing the notion of heroic individualism. From the Hellenic narratives of Heracles, Odysseus, and Achilles to historical mythologies such as those of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, and even modern mythologies of scientific innovation with figures such as Isaac Newton or Galileo, we see that the individual uniqueness of the human self is depicted as heroic in its defiance of social norms and expectations. Just as the moon casts the light of consciousness into the darkness of the night, the lunar consciousness of more Eastern civilizations is oriented more towards the past, and thus to ancestor worship, traditionalism, and an emphasis upon social conformity as a means of achieving collective cohesion. The light of the sun, conversely, is the light which we follow onto the horizon in pursuit of the future, which the archetypal hero's journey directs us towards. Western, solar-oriented culture forms thus tend to de-emphasize the past and the realm of the dead, as we see in the Homeric depiction of the underworld as a dark, gloomy realm of twittering souls. What is most significant here, however, is the way in which this distinction of emphasis between solar and lunar consciousness comes to express itself as distinctions in the metaphysical understanding of values and moral imperatives. Within lunar culture forms, morality tends to be understood as something which is simply identical to social conformity. Being good is understood as an adherence to the expectations and prohibitions of the social order. The idea that one could be morally righteous in defying the social order is barely even comprehensible within such a framework, as there is no notion of a transcendental good which might be at odds with that social order. The transcendental good simply is order through disciplinary conformity. Social order itself is seen as being an ultimate value in itself. Within Chinese cosmology, the bureaucratic order of terrestrial human civilization is seen to be a mirror image of the celestial bureaucracy. The divine right of the terrestrial order is understood as a mandate of heaven. Insofar as the earthly bureaucracy succeeds in creating order and stability, then this order is seen to be in accordance with the celestial order. What we must emphasize here is that within this understanding, social order, stability, and social conformity are themselves the transcendental values which the human world must aspire to emulate. The notion of a moral imperative which directs an individual to defy social conformity is incomprehensible, as social conformity itself is considered to be an ultimate value. We see this lunar orientation within the overall social project of the Han Chinese civilization throughout its history. The Han Chinese order expanded through a kind of cultural conversion, in which more parochial culture forms were swallowed up into Han Chinese culture. The Han Chinese prioritized the adoption of the Han Chinese language, social norms, institutions, and spiritual practices by whatever peoples came to be engulfed by the empire, as the Chinese saw such conformity as the primary value which conditioned the possibility of social harmony and stability. Looking now to the West, we can see a very different strategy of achieving social cohesion within the workings of the Roman Empire. The Romans had relatively little concern with converting conquered peoples to Romanhood. Conquered peoples were allowed to maintain their local customs, religious practices, regional laws, and social structures, given that Rome herself was receiving her taxes. The Roman strategy was therefore not one of enforced social homogeneity, but rather one of imposing order upon diversity through militaristic and economic power. The more solar and thus more future-oriented nature of Western cultures resulted in a laxing of emphasis upon adherence to traditions in comparison to more Eastern cultures. Due to this lack of concern with fastidiously maintaining fidelity and repetition of the past, this resulted in much greater fragmentation into localized provincial identities. Transforming all of the various peoples of the Mediterranean world into Romans would have been an immense expenditure of time and resources, which the Romans saw no need to engage in. Looking to Near Eastern empires which preceded Rome, such as the Achaemenid Empire, we see that this relatively lax attitude towards regional diversity has been a common theme throughout the history of the region as a whole. Overall, we can see that this underlying polarity of solar and lunar valences of human consciousness has given rise to two primary strategies for achieving social cohesion. One of social conformity and homogeneity, exemplified in the East, and another of militaristic power and financial exploitation, exemplified in the West. Within the West, however, this emphasis upon solar consciousness also conditioned the possibility of transcendental values which needn't be directly identified with social order itself. The possibility of a conception of ultimate concern, which extends beyond the polarity of order and chaos. It is here that we will begin to see the seeds which would come to spring forth as the Faustian bargain of modernity. Within the Christian Gospels, Christ warns his followers that to truly follow his path, one must place the value of this path above one's own family and even be willing to betray one's own family. Quote, "Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." End quote. Here we should note how distinctly Western this conception of morality truly is. It indicates an ultimate value which may not necessarily be in accordance with our familial obligations or social roles. Moreover, the Christian Gospels continually reinforce the suggestion that the ultimate value represented by Christ stands in defiant opposition to the social order of militaristic violence represented by the Roman Empire. Within the Christian Gospels, Christ encounters a demon which identifies itself as legion. It is sometimes suggested that this statement is simply intended to indicate that the demon is a multiplicity of beings, like some sort of hive mind. But this scene also very strongly suggests that the underlying power which animates the Roman legions is in fact a demonic force. The demon isn't simply named Legion. The demon is Legion. We can thus see here very clearly the implication that the ultimate cosmic value of Christianity cannot be simply equated with social order. It is a value which is explicitly understood to transcend the familial and social obligations which underlie conformity-based social organization modes, and even more emphatically, it is shown to be antithetical to the social organization modality of militaristic coercion, which we see exemplified by the Roman legions. In other words, the mode of social harmony implied by the Christian narrative must be a kind of social cohesion which is grounded in neither conformist homogeneity nor in the imposition of order through violence and financial exploitation. The societal ideal of Christianity is rather one in which social cohesion is to be achieved through a mutual orientation towards the achievement of theosis. It is through this commitment towards the realization of the will of God within the will of the individual human person that a new form of social cohesion is to be born. What this task then demands is the inner transformation of the human person through the embodiment of the cosmic logos, the love which is understood to be the divine will which generates and animates the world. This Christian imperative stands in stark contrast to both East Asian conceptions of transcendence as well as those found within the Indo-European diaspora. Within classical Platonism, as well as the various Indic philosophical traditions, we see a metaphysical interpretation of the cosmos within which the corporeal, sensory realm is considered to be a kind of illusion, as being less real than the fundamental reality of forms, Brahman or Satchidananda, which is said to underlie the natural world. The conception of spiritual transcendence that we find within these pre-Christic traditions, therefore, tends to be one of life denial, or the extrication of human consciousness from nature. Nature is seen to be an illusory, shadowy veil of suffering which human consciousness must escape through the achievement of spiritual enlightenment. Worldly existence is seen to be fundamentally flawed, imperfect, and undesirable, while the transcendental world is seen to be a realm of pure oneness, perfection, and bliss. Within the metaphysics of Christianity, on the other hand, the self-sacrifice of Christ is understood to be an act of God's love for the natural, bodily world. Christ incarnated as a human being and lived a life of selfless love for other human beings within the world. Thus, the ideal exemplified by Christ is not one of world disavowal, but rather of accepting worldly life and sacrificing one's life unto the cosmic project of world creation. The Christian ideal is not to achieve a state of transcendence in which all otherness is dissolved into an undifferentiated oneness, but rather an affirmation of otherness, and indeed a radical giving up of oneself to others. The project of following Christ, or achieving theosis, therefore, is an aim to be achieved within the world, not through escaping the world. Transcendence is not to be achieved through dissolving one's personal individuality into a primordial bliss, but rather through allowing the Spirit of Christ, the cosmic affirmation of otherness, which is in fact the Logos, to transform one's individual personhood, the individual will or soul or self, which distinguishes one from the world as a unique individuality within the world. The Christian project is one of recreating the qualities of the divine and universal within the corporeal particularity of the human person. It is thus a project of spiritualizing the bodily realm, not of escaping the bodily realm. It is then through this spiritualization or theosis of the human individual that the Christian societal project is to be achieved. Rather than a social order which is woven together by Roman violence power or by Eastern social homogeneity, the Christian life world is meant to be one in which social cohesion is achieved by a mutual orientation towards a transcendental good, namely the cosmic logos, and the task of theosis which is implicated by that logos. It is here that we must understand one crucial factor which radical traditionalists and Christians themselves tend to almost universally ignore, one which is absolutely crucial for understanding the subsequent history of Western civilization and, by extension, the history of the modern world as a whole. The fact that this Christian project of theosis and the creation of a worldly kingdom of Christ was never actually achieved. The implications of the Christian project are far, far more radical than the vast majority of self-identified Christians tend to realize. There is absolutely no room whatsoever within the imperative laid out by the Christian narrative for a compromise with the hierarchies of violence power exemplified by the Roman Empire. The life world implicated by the Christian metaphysical narrative must be one in which human beings achieve social cohesion through love. Through the logos itself, in other words. Hierarchical violence power necessarily implicates a social teleology within which human beings are required to regard the achievement and preservation of such structures of violence power as ends in themselves. Within such a social order, human beings have little choice but to pursue the goals of power aggregation, domination, and exploitation, unless they are to take the much more radical position of simply refusing to play that game at all, which, incidentally, is exactly what Christ implored his followers to do. Yet this is not, in fact, what was actually achieved by the world we refer to as Christendom. There is no possibility of a stable compromise between the Roman spirit and the spirit of Christ, and yet such a compromise is exactly what was attempted historically. Seeing that their world was on the brink of total collapse, the Romans saw that the only way to preserve the power structures of Rome against the rising tides was through an attempt to Romanize Christianity, and this is exactly what they did. The story of exactly how Paleo-Christianity came to be transformed into Romanized institutional structures is a very long and complex one which extends far beyond the scope of this video, but there are definitely some disclaimers which I need to make here nonetheless. Many Christians are probably going to perceive my argument here as insinuating that the Romanized versions of Christianity, such as Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity, were never truly Christian. Those Christians will then probably begin pointing to the church fathers and arguing that figures such as St. Augustine, Pseudo-Dionysius, Nicholas of Cusa, or others show us that these church institutions were in fact institutional embodiments of a genuinely Christian spirit. Indeed, I do believe that many of the intellectual and apostolic figures who were foundational to the development of early Christianity were certainly very genuine in their beliefs and in their moral projects. I'm also definitively not arguing that Christianity itself failed to genuinely transform human beings in meaningful ways. I'm also not arguing that any given religious tradition, whether Catholic, Orthodox, Anglican, or Protestant, is disingenuous or flawed. I am not trying to shake anyone's allegiance to their religious practices or creeds per se. What I am arguing, however, is that the institutional and socio-political structures of Christendom were never truly Christian because they never lived up to the extreme radicalism which is actually implicated by Christian metaphysics. Within various forms of Paleo-Christianity, or so-called Gnosticism, we see the notion of gnosis featured as an essential aspect of the project of achieving theosis. In order for one to be truly transformed by the Logos, an individual human person must actually make spiritual contact with the Logos itself. in order to be truly transformed by the love of God, such that one's will is reshaped into accordance with that cosmic logos, one must actually perceive what that cosmic love amounts to. One must achieve gnosis in order to achieve theosis. It is not enough to simply go through the motions of a religious tradition or to profess belief in a certain religious creed. A personal relationship is required, and this must be a relationship of understanding. Simply believing is insufficient if one lacks any real understanding of what one is professing belief in. And yet the Roman compromise with Christianity, which gave rise to Christendom, was one in which this notion of gnosis was declared to be heretical, and for the vast majority of self-professed Christians, simply going through the motions was deemed to be adequate. The political radicalism of Christianity was thereby mitigated and suppressed, and this compromise thus resulted in an inner tension between the spirit of Rome and the spirit of Christianity, which would then become the prime mover of subsequent human history. Despite being suppressed by the institutional structures which came to envelop it, the radicalism of the Christian spirit would continue to quietly reshape the consciousness of the Western world. One way in which this would come to be expressed is in the development of medieval Christian alchemy. Interestingly, we see a parallel alchemical tradition within Chinese culture as well, and understanding the similarities and differences between Christian and Chinese alchemy can help us to elucidate the underlying forces at work here. Both Christian and Chinese alchemy sought to achieve immortality or eternal life through a project which was simultaneously spiritual and naturalistic. Within both traditions, this project was understood as a project of spiritualizing the bodily realm. Within pre-Christian Platonic or Indic philosophies, such a project would have seemed incomprehensible. True knowledge was understood to be that which transcended the corporeal, natural realm, and therefore true knowledge, particularly knowledge of true spiritual relevance, was not something which one might derive from the study of the natural world. The project of achieving transcendence was one to be achieved through pure reason itself, or through retreating from the world through meditative practices. Unlike Indo-European cosmologies, however, Chinese cosmology lacks such a definitive division between the natural and transcendental realms. As we saw previously, Chinese cosmologies see the order of the world and the order of the heavens as essentially identical, the primary difference being that chaos is seen to be a feature of the natural world but not of the celestial realm. There is no real notion of a natural order which is entirely distinct from the celestial order. As such, Chinese thinkers were much less inclined to see the natural realm as being a mere illusion or shadow, and much more inclined towards the possibility of achieving spiritual liberation through knowledge garnered from the natural world. Similarly, the Christian project of achieving theosis came to incline Western thinkers and mystics towards nature. If the ultimate spiritual project of humanity is understood to be the spiritualization of the bodily realm, rather than extrication from it, then it follows that one must attain an understanding of the natural world in order to effectively facilitate the spiritualization of the natural world. If one is to transmute the bodily realm such that it achieves the qualities of the pure and eternal, then one must endeavor to understand the compositional features of the bodily realm. Within Christian alchemy, we see this project expressed as the project of transmuting lead into gold. Lead is associated with the archetype of Saturn, of concreteness and solidity, of the fixity of the past and the inertia of the past, of gravity, mass, and weight, of contraction and immobility. The Saturnian archetype therefore represents the most materialistic aspects of nature. Gold, conversely, is associated with the sun, with the soul, and with the spirit of Christ. Gold is representative of ultimate values and of the human will which is drawn forward or lured in pursuit of such values. The sun, and by extension gold, represents the individual human self, which is defined in relation to such an inner will, in contrast to the silvery, lunar, relational human self, which is defined in terms of immanent, familial, metabolic relationships. The project of transmuting lead into gold is therefore indicative of the archetypal structure of Christian alchemy in general and the underlying Christian impulse itself. Gold is here the higher self, the inner Christic soul, which is drawn forward and defined through its relationship to the Christic logos, and which, through this pursuit, comes to achieve the redemption, purification, harmonization, and rebirth of the Saturnian, corporeal, and materialistic realm. Similarly, Chinese alchemy sought to achieve such perfection of the body through the ingression of celestial order into the bodily realm, but it was Christian alchemy and not Chinese alchemy which gave birth to modern science. The most crucial reason for this divergence lies in the polarity of emphasis between Western and Eastern cultures, which we have already examined. The lunar emphasis of Chinese culture is fundamentally oriented towards notions of traditionalism, the adherence to received wisdom, conventions, norms, duties, and social obligations. The solar emphasis of Christendom is far more future-oriented and thus far more oriented towards individuality, and much more accepting of divergence from traditions and received wisdom. The Christian psyche was thus much more favorable towards radical breaks from the past by new ideas. Christian intellectual culture as a whole was then much more open to the novel insights developed by alchemists such as Paracelsus, Robert Boyle, and Isaac Newton, and much more open to René Descartes' drastic departure from traditional Western metaphysics. Radical traditionalists are typically inclined to see these departures from tradition as a degeneration by which the wisdom of the past has been sacrificed to misguided ideals of progress. But such a perspective lacks the insight that these radical departures from the past have in fact been driven by deeply rooted underlying forces which reside within the Western tradition itself. Within the deepest, most fundamental workings of the Western psyche, we find an imperative which has driven the West towards the development of the individual, independent human intellect, because although Christian institutional religions have long since abandoned the imperative of theosis through gnosis, the collective unconscious of the Western psyche has not. Moreover, it cannot abandon that imperative, as the project of theosis itself requires that the individual human telos be transformed by a cosmic logos, which that inner will must make direct contact with and freely choose. One cannot love another because one is simply told to do so. Love cannot be a mere going through the motions, and as such, the very project of Christendom itself has necessitated the development of the individual human being's moral and intellectual agency. When we look upon the overall scope of Western history since the advent of Christianity, what we see is a tumultuous and often cataclysmic process, whereby the drive towards theosis within the Western psyche has necessitated the annihilation of the traditional structures which have impeded that directive. Understood within this context, we can thus see that the forces which have driven modern history have been much more than mere degeneration and decay. Certainly there are many aspects of the past which we would do well to reclaim. Classical metaphysics and esotericism, for example, contain a wealth of profound insights, and modern intellectualism has become an utterly convoluted maelstrom in their absence. Nonetheless, this process is not without purpose. Moral agency requires freedom. It requires that the individual human will be oriented towards a given teleological aim, eidos, or ultimate value. Theosis thus requires a freedom which cannot be reduced to mere adherence to institutionalized norms, customs, rituals, or prohibitions, even if such institutionalized performances might themselves play a crucial role in the cultivation of moral agency. None of this is to say that traditions and institutions can simply be dispensed with entirely, nor to say that the version of progress offered by neoliberal globalism is preferable to traditional cultures. It is rather to say that the breakdown of Western culture throughout modern history has been driven by an underlying imperative towards the realization of an as yet unfulfilled destiny, which requires the radical transformation of both human social organization and individual human selfhood. Many modern academics and even radical traditionalists regard Western individualism as though it were merely a contingent, superficial idiosyncrasy of Western cultures. Here we can see clearly that it is much, much more, and moreover, this project of realizing individual human freedom, intellectual agency, and moral agency is no longer a uniquely Western phenomenon at all, and is increasingly coming to be a global narrative which all human beings are implicated within. Sociopolitically, this trajectory implies the realization of a new kind of human culture and a new form of human social cohesion. Psychologically, it implies a realization of a human self-construct, which is far more individualized and far more empowered by moral and intellectual agency. Metaphysically, this is not merely a project which is peculiar to the destiny of Western civilization, although Western civilization has played a central role in this narrative thus far, but rather this narrative is the enactment of the cosmic logos itself, the realization of ultimate value, of ultimate numinosity, through the recreation of the universal qualities of cosmic consciousness within the individual consciousness of the human person. In essentially every aspect and phase of modern history, we see this process unfolding in different ways. Within the Protestant Reformation, we see the insistence that contact with the divine must be direct and personal rather than mediated by clerical bureaucracies. Now lacking such a unifying institutional structure or monolithic traditional framework of biblical interpretation, Protestantism then came to fragment into innumerable parochial strains. Protestantism follows through on the underlying Christian imperative of individual moral commitment, but Protestantism also emerged at a time when the intellectual agency of ordinary human individuals was almost entirely nascent. Having abandoned the traditional frameworks of Catholic and Orthodox Neoplatonism and Aristotelianism, Protestantism lacked any means of consistently interpreting the Christian doctrines themselves. Without a metaphysical framework for biblical interpretation, Protestantism instead drifted towards a materialistic and historicist literalism, which would bring it into intense conflict with the scientific paradigms which would emerge alongside it. Within Catholic and Orthodox traditions, the role of biblical interpretation was reserved almost entirely for a clerical elite which was thoroughly educated within the Western metaphysical and theological tradition. This meant that these traditions were much more consistent and metaphysically coherent than most forms of Protestantism, but it also meant that within these traditions, the gnosis required for a genuine moral commitment to the Christic Logos was also reserved for an elite minority. The fulfillment of the Christic imperative would require that intellectual agency be developed among ordinary individuals, such that individual human beings in general, rather than a clerical elite, would be able to achieve a genuine direct contact with the divine and the personal transformation achieved by such contact. Within the ideology of liberal democracy, we can also see the implications of a distinctly Christian imperative of spiritual freedom, that genuine belief cannot be coerced and therefore that one's religious and metaphysical commitments must be freely chosen. In accordance with this, liberalism ensures certain natural rights, which are said to be intrinsic to the nature of human individuality itself. This liberal paradigm then came to merge with the techno-science, which had come to emerge from medieval alchemy, thus giving rise to the capitalistic social order and subsequently to industrialization. Out of this paradigm of industrial capitalism would emerge the revolutionary ideologies of anarchism and Marxism. Within the 19th century zeitgeist, Western civilization had already become deeply alienated from its Christic foundations in many ways, particularly within the realm of intellectual cultures. Thus, anarchism and Marxism tended to take highly secular, materialistic, or atheistic forms. Nonetheless, we can see that in various ways, Marxism and anarchism are in fact materialistic, ostensibly atheistic reiterations of the same underlying Christic imperative towards individual agency, collective moral responsibility, and the creation of a social order which achieves cohesion through mutual solidarity rather than coercion or conformity. Modern historical developments such as these have certainly been destructive in numerous ways, and radical traditionalists are certainly right to observe that these developments have tended to result in the breakdown of social cohesion. If we look to the larger narrative at work here, however, we can see that these developments have also been generating a groundwork for the possibility of genuine moral and intellectual agency among individual human beings. In essence, this journey which we find ourselves within can be understood as an enactment of the individuation process, myth cycle or monomyth of Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell, one which is occurring not at the scale of the individual human psyche, but rather at the scale of humanity's historical trajectory of consciousness evolution, a global collective hero's journey, as it were. The process of individuation begins with separation from the womb, family, home, or tribe. We lose the security and familiarity of the ordinary world and are cast into the darkness of uncertainty and turmoil. Through the trials which we are then beset with, we come to develop the capabilities needed to protect and provide for ourselves and for others. We develop a sense of independence, agency, and self-efficacy, and thus come to develop cohesive, stable structures of egoic self-identity. Following this separation and individuation, we then come to reintegrate ourselves with that which has been lost. We reclaim the aspects of ourselves which came to be ignored or suppressed within our journey of separation. As a whole, what these cycles of separation and reintegration achieve is the realization of the higher self. The ego which is created through the process of separation is not the genuine self. When we use the term I, we are very often referring to the ego or persona, when in reality the true I, that which encompasses the totality of our being, is the spiritual eidos, a structure of idyllic potentiality which conditions the possibility of the various psychical structures which comprise us. The ego is merely an organ of the soul, as it were, and the process of individuation is one through which the human psyche comes to be reshaped, so as to reflect the compositional harmony of this higher self. As Carl Jung himself observed, the figure of Christ can be understood as representing the archetypal nature of the higher self. Christ represents the ideal of a human person who is completely transformed from within by the cosmic logos. Insofar as the human soul can be understood as a kind of higher will, and the logos as the will of God, then the logos which lies within the core of the human soul can be understood as the world soul, which strives to bring the more outward manifestations of the human being into accordance with this cosmic will. The Christ within us is this logos, and the project of theosis is then one of achieving the transformation of the human person, which this logos demands of us. So now let us return to the radical traditionalist disavowal of the modern world. Oswald Spengler, in his Anatomy of Civilizational Life Cycles, tells us that during the latest stages of a civilization's life, a people will begin tending towards the incorporation of cultural motifs from beyond the bounds of their own life world. We can certainly see this tendency among many New Age subcultures as well as academic cultures, wherein the fetishization of Eastern spiritual traditions and the disdain for Western culture have been in vogue for nearly a century now. Ironically, however, we also see this tendency among rad-trads themselves, though in a much more self-obfuscated manner. Rad-trads decry the social breakdown of modernity and therefore tend to perceive social order as an ultimate value. Yet through this idealization of social order, radtrads have developed a tendency of construing traditional Western values as though they were Eastern values, placing enormous emphasis on the ideals of social homogeneity, conformity, reverence for the past, and collectivism. What these radical traditionalists tend to turn a blind eye to is the fact that the process of modernization has in fact been driven by aspects of the Western tradition itself, which have emphasized individual moral and intellectual agency, individual uniqueness, and a willingness to prioritize the future rather than strict adherence to the past. It is immensely appropriate, then, that René Guénon, perhaps one of the most vicious radtrad critics of modernity, converted to Islam, as he saw quite correctly that Christianity itself tends to erode the very institutions which underlie it. Radical traditionalists tend to romanticize the Western tradition in such a manner that it, quite ironically, becomes rendered as something distinctly non-Western. Radtrads tend to fantasize the possibility of recreating whatever period of Western history they regard as being the Golden Age. Orthodox Christians dream of recreating the time before the Great Schism without realizing that the Christic impulse itself created that very schism. Catholics dream of a time before the Protestant Reformation without realizing that the inner depths of Catholicism itself necessitated that Reformation. Protestants dream of a time before the advent of secularism without realizing that Protestantism itself necessitated the development of such secularism. Every step of the way has been a process of division and separation, which has been demanded by the underlying impulse towards the realization of human freedom, which is required in order to achieve the great unfulfilled promise of human history, the realization of a genuinely Christic civilization. Separation demands reintegration, and although it is far from clear that we are reaching the axial turn of this individuating cycle, there is certainly some indication that we are approaching some sort of climax. The September 11th terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center in New York City represent one of the most pivotal turning points in the history of the United States, and by extension, the modern world as such. The fallout from these events was unfathomably tremendous in terms of cultural and political developments. For our current purposes, however, I would like to focus specifically on the manner in which the September 11th attacks conditioned the subsequent cultural zeitgeist regarding the relationships between science, secularism, religion, and spirituality. Following these cataclysmic and traumatic events, the neoconservative political tribes of the United States and other Western cultures came to develop a narrative of xenophobic cultural incommensurability. The September 11th attacks were said to be the result of Islam, which was depicted as being a barbaric, backwards, and intolerant religious cult which Westerners needed to fight back against at all costs. Within the cultural haze of collective trauma and fear which surrounded the September 11th attacks, this narrative was very appealing to many of the more conservative subcultures of the Western world. Within this narrative framing, Christianity was good and Islam was bad, and Western nations were morally obligated to use military force to protect their culture from the aggression of violent, irrational peoples. Although the more left-leaning subcultures of the West rejected the hawkish militarism of this neoconservative vision, it simply wasn't enough to argue that Islam and Christianity were both religions of peace and that in actuality complex geopolitical forces had resulted in the recent terrorist attacks. Some leftists did in fact make arguments like this, but at the time those commentators were generally seen as spineless shills or out-of-touch hippies at best or outright traitors at worst. The people of the United States in particular felt like they needed someone to blame and something to be the target of their vindictiveness. As such, the more left-leaning narrative which would actually gather traction in opposition to the neoconservative narrative was something more like this. Islamic extremism was in fact responsible for September 11th and other such terrorist attacks, but the underlying evil at work was not Islam per se, but rather religiosity itself. This narrative came to depict religiosity in general as a kind of backwards and potentially dangerous anti-rationalism, which stood in opposition to the Enlightenment ideals of secularism, democracy, and techno-scientific progress. This narrative allowed such left-leaning individuals to have their cake and eat it too. They could give their audience the target of indignation which they desired, while also painting the neoconservatives as religious fruitcakes who were guilty of the exact same irrationalism, xenophobia, and dogmatism which had facilitated acts of terrorism such as the September 11th attacks. Faith in general was depicted as simply being belief without reason or evidence, and therefore faith was seen to be a kind of naive credulity which left human beings vulnerable to being manipulated by religious belief systems which were seen to be tools of coercion and manipulation. Within certain subcultures of the Western world, this ideological paradigm of anti-religious atheism came to gain an enormous amount of traction. This ideology was not necessarily new, and in fact we can see that such atheism and anti-theism were quite popular within certain academic subcultures as early as the 19th century. But it was in the early years of the 21st century, within the wake of the September 11th attacks and the Middle Eastern wars of the Bush administration, that such atheism came to be a force in its own right within popular culture. Over the course of the 20th century, Western peoples had come to be much more educated within the frameworks of materialistic science and liberal arts. Simultaneously, the cultural developments which followed the Second World War had resulted in an immense accentuation of social alienation through the breakdown of traditional social structures such as communities and nuclear families, a process which, as we can see, was only the most recent unfolding of a much more encompassing process which had been accelerating for many centuries already. The groundwork had thus been laid for atheistic materialism to truly take root, no longer as a strictly academic phenomenon, but rather as a phenomenon which would come to completely reshape popular culture in general. Over the course of the 20th century, religiosity had already come to be increasingly quarantined away from the public sphere and into the private. Yet the vast majority of ordinary Westerners maintained some form of religious adherence. Within the opening decade of the 21st century, however, even private religiosity would begin to rapidly disintegrate. Figures such as Dan Dennett, Richard Dawkins, Stephen Hawking, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and many other self-professed atheists who proudly wore the mantle of academic prestige would come to popularize atheistic materialism for audiences which had themselves become much more intellectualized in a distinctly secular manner, and thus more open to the possibility of a worldview which did away with religiosity in general. This cultural current of atheistic materialism would then violently clash with the old guard of Western religions, particularly with the Protestant forms of Christianity, which had become acutely literalistic and materialistic in their own right due to having largely abandoned Platonic and Aristotelian metaphysics. Such Protestants had come to see the Bible as quite literally an account of historical events, which were no different than those found in any other historical documents. Many of them believed that the Earth's age was measured in a small handful of millennia rather than many billions of years, and many were staunchly opposed to any scientific claims of cosmic or Darwinian evolution. The stark contrast between these two worldviews would then be brought out of the academic world and into the public sphere through innumerable popular science and philosophy books, as well as by the rapidly expanding realm of internet-based media. Through these conflicts, it was seen that many of the figures representing the old guard of literalistic religiosity were hopelessly underprepared to defend their worldview from the criticisms which their atheistic opponents presented. It isn't terribly easy to defend a worldview in which the Earth is said to be 6,000 years old from academic scientists who are able to bring to bear even a superficial understanding of geology, biology, and astrophysics. To be clear, I am not implying that the worldview of the New Atheists was actually correct. And in fact, I would go so far as to say that the New Atheist worldview is just as inadequate as the biblical literalism which they set themselves in opposition to. Nonetheless, it was by and large the case that the new atheists were perceived to be victorious in many of the intellectual battles which they engaged in, and this perceived dominance only fueled the growing tendency toward secularism among the educated laypersons who were the target audiences of these debates. In less than a decade, atheistic or agnostic materialism came to be the rule rather than the exception among many subcultures of educated Westerners. Yet, even as this zeitgeist of secularism came to reach its zenith, one figure in particular would come to profoundly challenge this increasingly dominant atheistic ideology. And that figure was Jordan Peterson. Now, of course, many of you might be rolling your eyes at even the mention of Jordan Peterson. Peterson's role as a highly public and politicized intellectual figure has resulted in the man's popular image coming to be caricaturized beyond recognition, and Peterson himself holds a great deal of responsibility for the creation of this popular persona. Nonetheless, the influence which Peterson has exerted in the development of cultural dialogue among educated laypersons must be recognized, especially within this context. Peterson is widely known for his highly combative role within Western culture wars, but far more significant has been his contribution to the development of what is effectively a new form of religiosity among educated Westerners. Peterson brought into this ongoing conflict between religiosity and secularism a perspective on the Western religious tradition which most people in general, even the highly educated, had never before encountered. Rather than attempting to argue that biblical narratives were historical events, Peterson instead interpreted biblical narratives through the lens of Jungian psychodynamic theories. Rather than engaging in debates about whether or not these narratives were true in some materialistic sense, Peterson instead revealed to his audience the manner in which religious narratives and traditions could be seen to reveal an archetypal reality which transcended the particularity and contingency of historical accounts. The events being described within these religious narratives were thus depicted as eternal events rather than as historical material events. Although Peterson's approach might have seemed highly obscure and unorthodox to many, whether religious or secular, his presentations nonetheless came to find an enormous audience within what would become known as the intellectual dark web, which in more recent years has become simply the intellectual web, given that it is now far too mainstream to be regarded as dark in any meaningful sense. What is of immense significance here is the fact that Peterson's interpretations of biblical narratives paved the way for an orientation towards religiosity which was, for the most part, entirely novel within the realm of modern educated laypersons. His perspective on the biblical narratives wasn't necessarily anything new in itself, as very similar interpretations can be found throughout the entirety of the Western theological tradition. What was radically novel, however, was that Peterson was able to present such interpretations in a manner that was just intellectual enough to bypass the materialistic incredulity of his educated audience members, while nonetheless appealing to a deep longing for meaning and purpose, which those educated laypersons now realize to be profoundly lacking within their lives and worldviews. Peterson would set the stage for a much more intellectualized and esoteric sense of spirituality, which would come to be further popularized by figures such as Jonathan Peugeot, Robert Barron, Jean Vervaeke, that kid from the Telos Bound channel, Galahad Eridanus, and, of course, Formscapes. Again, here I should emphasize that this intellectualized sense of spirituality is really nothing new in and of itself. The Christian theological tradition, as we have already noted, has been steeped in the intellectual traditions of Platonism, Aristotelianism, and Hermeticism from its very origins. Yet for the vast majority of self-identified Christians throughout the vast majority of Western history, this intellectualism was as alien as a completely foreign culture, and was generally reserved for an elite caste of educated clerical bureaucrats. Most people simply believed what they were told to believe, or at least professed belief in that which they were supposed to profess belief in. Although the influence of this new spirituality has yet to truly rival the influence once held by the new atheism, these are tides which are changing very rapidly. And if we take stock of the overall trajectory of this process, what we see is a microcosm of the much larger narrative which I have been attempting to elucidate here. A highly accelerated microcycle, which is self-similar to the larger world historical cycle which it is embedded within. This new spirituality is one in which the intellect of the individual layperson is able to directly engage with the metaphysical implications of religious narratives. Within this process, we can thus see the unfolding of a kind of moral and imaginal freedom which has been unavailable to the vast majority of human beings who have ever lived throughout human history. Faith is far more than mere groundless belief. Faith is a moral commitment to an as-yet unrealized possibility. It is a commitment which can, through the very power of its own conviction, realize that which was otherwise impossible. Yet such faith, far from relying upon ignorance and naive credulity, can only achieve its true potential when it is realized through a genuine understanding, a genuine gnosis of that which one is committing oneself to. The rise and decline of the new atheism and the correlative ascent of the new spirituality have been processes whereby the conditions for the possibility of such gnosis have been further germinated within the human psyche, even if this is a process which has taken place among relatively minor subcultures within the overall landscape of modern culture as a whole. But it is also here that we can see even more clearly the inner conflicts between traditionalist ideologies and the overall teleology of the Western tradition. Jordan Peterson identifies himself as a classical liberal, and as such his personal ideology might seem rather far removed from radical traditionalists like Evola and Guénon. However, we can see within Peterson the same inner turmoil that results from the friction between a desire to conserve the Western cultural tradition and the deeply radical implications of that very tradition. As a public figure, Peterson initially found a widespread audience among individuals, particularly young men, who had come to find themselves utterly lost within the alienating maelstrom of modernity. The male psyche, generally speaking, is much more dependent upon having a central locus of purpose, value, and meaning. Women, of course, do experience a need for such purpose, but the lack of such purpose tends to be far more psychologically catastrophic for men than for women. Due to the cultural breakdown of modernity, the acuity of this lack has become ever sharper, for young men in particular, with each passing decade. The solution which Peterson presented in relation to this problem was highly paternalistic and Jovian in nature. Peterson encouraged his audience to find ambition, strength, and courage within themselves, to reject the temptation to wallow in apathy and defeatism, to develop a sense of self-efficacy and self-responsibility rather than waiting for someone or something else to save them. In many ways, this is exactly what such an audience needed to hear. The modern world is not only one within which meaning, purpose, and value have been almost entirely sterilized from the public sphere, but it is also one within which modern culture itself has come to perform the role of the devouring mother, an infantilizing force which acts to distort the natural development of the human ego by providing easy access to cheap comforts and securities. In other words, there were, in fact, many young men who really did need to hear some paternalistic, Jovian figure yell at them to clean their rooms and take charge of their lives. And Peterson's use of psychologized biblical motifs certainly contributed to speaking to human beings who, regardless of their professed beliefs, contain an unconscious which has been deeply shaped by these religious narratives. It is here, however, that Peterson's message of personal development bleeds into his political stances. Jordan Peterson has been greatly influenced by the works of both Fyodor Dostoevsky and Friedrich Nietzsche, and it is through those two thinkers that Peterson has come to develop his own conceptions regarding the archetypal character of evil. The story here begins with Dostoevsky's short novella, Notes from the Underground. Within Notes from the Underground, we follow the self-narration of a man who is commonly referred to as the Underground Man. The Underground Man is a disenfranchised young man who thinks of himself as highly educated and intellectual, and thus superior to the people around him, but who also sees himself as weak and downtrodden, as having been unjustly robbed of the fame and fortune which he deserves by an unjust world which fails to see value in his own genius. Notice the striking similarity here between Dostoevsky's Underground Man and Goethe's Heinrich Faust, who we examined earlier. You will also probably notice that both of these mythical figures share a common archetypal composition with the disenfranchised young men who have been Jordan Peterson's primary target audience. The Underground Man is consumed by vanity, rage, narcissistic delusions, and, most significantly, resentment. The Underground Man sees his own destitution and weakness as signifiers of his own moral superiority over the other people who the Underground Man feels have unjustly benefited from life more so than he has. He is a person who has essentially fallen in love with his own weakness, his own failures, and his own indignation. Turning now to the works of Friedrich Nietzsche, we see this motif of psychological resentment elaborated even further, as Nietzsche comes to develop his notion of a transvaluation of values, expressed primarily within his work, The Genealogy of Morals. Within the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche presents us with a kind of mythologized narrative which begins with a kind of primeval state of moral conceptions. There is not yet any understanding of good and evil, but rather only an understanding of good and bad. That which is good is simply understood as that which is furthering of bodily life. The good is food, wealth, power, sexuality, joy, intoxication, freedom from constraint, and in general that which furthers human vitality in a very metabolic, corporeal sense. The bad is then understood to be hunger, pain, poverty, weakness, celibacy, constraint, and guilt, things which are detrimental or destructive of such vitality. But within this primeval state, a nefarious force comes into play, that of resentment. Nietzsche believed that resentment came to form primarily within the priestly class. The priests were individuals who were very intelligent and cunning, much like the Underground Man or Heinrich Faust, yet who lacked the vitalizing power of the warrior nobility which dominated such primeval societies. The priests came to resent their own lack of power, and the fact that the warrior nobility wielded such power even without the intelligence and wisdom which they believed to make one deserving of such power. Nietzsche speculates that this priestly class consisted of individuals who tended to be very sickly, and that their lack of bodily vitality is what conditioned them for the development of intellectual faculties rather than worldly achievements. As it just so happens, archaeological findings seem to actually corroborate Nietzsche's speculations. Within the graves of Paleolithic and Neolithic shamans, we find that such shamans were in fact often afflicted with physical abnormalities. This priestly class lacked the strength needed to actually overthrow the warrior nobility, but these priests were, Nietzsche tells us, very cunning and driven by an unwavering indignation, which would fuel a plot of vengeance, which would be patiently enacted over the course of many generations. This great plot of revenge was the transvaluation of values. Through this transvaluation, the priests would reconfigure the moral fabric of human culture itself such that all of the things once considered bad, weakness, hunger, poverty, and celibacy, would become the new good within a framework of ascetic values. Conversely, the old good, vitality, power, sexuality, and wealth, would become the new evil. It is through this transvaluation of values, Nietzsche argued, that Western civilization had come to be characterized by an inverted, life-denying morality which was fueled by resentment, bitterness, and an overall sense of disgust towards life itself. From the perspective of Jordan Peterson, this disavowal of life was in fact the great evil, which threatened to destroy both the lives of human beings as well as the very fabric of Western civilization itself. Peterson came to see that various radical strains of revolutionary politics, such as Marxism and postmodernism, were in fact driven primarily by such an underlying resentment, bitterness, and life denial. Within these ideologies, Peterson saw a vilification of success, prosperity, abundance, self-efficacy, and independence, an ideological and psychological complex which Peterson saw to be immensely toxic and corrosive to life itself. The great temptation of evil, as Peterson came to see it, was this falling in love with one's own weakness and destitution, the temptation of reframing one's own failings as though they were some heroic martyrdom. Peterson saw that any social order must achieve cohesion through a mutual orientation towards a hierarchy of values. Resentment, therefore, is the ultimate threat to human solidarity insofar as it threatens to turn us against the values which are the very condition for the possibility of human flourishing itself. Thus, Peterson came to see that the underlying force which threatened to trap his audience of disenfranchised young men in cycles of self-destructive bitterness and apathy was in fact the exact same evil which drove our most totalitarian and life-annihilating political tendencies as well. As such, Peterson has emerged as a champion of traditional values, which he sees as being an antidote to such life-annihilating resentment. Peterson seeks to dissuade his audience from falling in love with their own weaknesses and their own failures, and instead to see self-responsibility, strength, prosperity, and vitality as values which we must orient ourselves towards. So, this all seems very well and good, except for one tiny issue. That within the very Western tradition that Peterson encourages us to return to is the figure of an emaciated, dirty, naked peasant nailed to a piece of wood after having proclaimed to be the king of the destitute. Peterson's attempts to reconcile his own ideology with the Christian Gospels has been rather awkward at best. The hierarchy of transcendental values is, as Peterson sees it, one which must prioritize prosperity, success, and vitality, the core archetypal features of the Jovian father-king, who was indeed regarded as the central deity and thus the highest value throughout most of Indo-European history prior to the advent of Christianity. Yet, with Christianity, we see something radically different, and something which in many ways might appear to be awfully similar to the very resentment-fueled transvaluation of values which Peterson sees as the root of all evil. Yet the Christian Gospels do not seem to indicate that such resentment is the root of all evil. What they instead indicate is that the love of money is the root of all evil. The Gospels clearly indicate in numerous ways that the will to power is very much not the highest value which Christ represents, and very explicitly indicates that such will to power is, or at least can be, completely antithetical to the ultimate value which Christ is said to embody. This leaves Peterson in a rather awkward position, and one which is very similar to the corner which more radical traditionalists also find themselves painted into. Peterson wants to tell us that the pursuits of wealth and success are in fact positive values, and that the Marxian disavowal of such vitality is in fact an expression of life-denying evil. Peterson fancies himself to be a classical liberal, and as such sees the self-interested entrepreneurship of capitalism to be a cornerstone of the liberal value structure which he wishes to champion. And yet, Christ explicitly tells his followers to give away their possessions and to have faith that God will provide for his own. Peterson thus finds himself awkwardly attempting to reinterpret the Christian Gospels as though they were articulations of a Jovian value hierarchy, even though they quite clearly and explicitly are not. Some radical traditionalists simply bite the proverbial bullet on this issue. As previously mentioned, René Guénon turned away from the Christian tradition entirely in favor of Islam. More recently, many rad-trads have instead turned towards pre-Christian polytheism in order to avoid the need to square this circle. If one is a pagan, then there is no need to reconcile the Jovian value hierarchy with that of Christ, as most forms of paganism are characterized by value hierarchies which are actually Jovian rather than Christic. Ultimately, the problem here with regards to Jordan Peterson himself is Peterson's own reluctance to actually commit himself to any explicit, realist metaphysics. Peterson is, of course, a psychologist, not a metaphysician, and in general he has tended to see the transcendental values implicated by mythical narratives as only real insofar as they can be referred back to actual, concrete social orders. Peterson can justify regarding these myths as true in the sense that they are expressions of actual social orders which actually facilitate the perpetuation of human life in the natural world. He is therefore not required to make any more ontologically substantial claims about transcendental values which might be said to exist independently of the world as it currently is. Peterson often characterizes himself as a pragmatist, in the sense that one might regard a belief as being true insofar as it actually facilitates the values which one is oriented towards. Peterson can thus suggest that believing in God need not require any substantive ontological claims, as belief in God can simply amount to orienting oneself towards the world as though God were real. Insofar as acting as though one believed is able to facilitate human flourishing, then we can regard the belief in God as being effectively true. Thus, Peterson tells us that one must strive to believe, even though truly believing might be a goal which we can only ever approximate. Unfortunately for Peterson, what Christianity actually demands of us is in fact far more radical. Christianity implicates an ultimate value which, as yet, has never actually been realized within a living human social order, at least not on the scale of an entire people or civilization. Christianity cannot justify belief in its own ultimate value by pointing to a social order like Rome or liberal capitalism, which can be said to embody such a value hierarchy. Christianity requires a commitment to the actualization of a possibility which might very well seem to be utterly impossible, of a human life world which is woven together by love, rather than the will to power. Faith in that project is not a pragmatic pseudo-belief, but rather a moral commitment through which the impossible can be realized. Within Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, we see a much more thoroughly elaborated reiteration of the archetypal motifs which we saw within Notes from the Underground. Much like the underground man, Raskolnikov is a disenfranchised, intellectually inclined, Faustian young man living in St. Petersburg. He is broke and lonely, and within his own mind he comes to believe that if he were unrestrained by the moral prohibitions of the world around him, then he would be able to ameliorate the injustices which he sees around him, as well as within his own personal life. Raskolnikov comes to be possessed by the idea of enacting this fantasy by murdering a pawnbroker who lives near him. He sees this woman as a parasite who preys upon the destitute and believes that if there were any justice in this world, then she would be forced to pay for her crimes and ill-gotten gains with her life. Eventually, Raskolnikov proceeds to do just that. He murders the pawnbroker with an axe and takes her trove of valuables for himself, as he sees himself as far more deserving of these riches. Raskolnikov succeeds in getting away with his crime, but soon thereafter we begin to see that Raskolnikov's murder of the pawnbroker begins to eat away at him from the insides of his own psyche. Guilt, shame, and paranoia begin to metastasize within him, eventually coming to envelop his entire life within a mire of disorientation and turmoil, which brings him to the very edge of madness. However, within Crime and Punishment, we see no indication that Raskolnikov was wrong in seeing that the social order of his world was unjust. In fact, throughout the novel, we see the injustice of this world on gruesome display in a number of ways. Jordan Peterson implores us to see that our own turmoils are due to our own personal failures to accord with the value structures which are implicit within the life worlds we inhabit. He insists that we come to see that the hierarchies of power, wealth, and control within our world are morally correct, and to disavow the intellectual hubris with which we might come to believe that we could recreate the world into something better. Within Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, what we see is something much more nuanced. Raskolnikov is certainly depicted as being morally wrong in his murder of the pawnbroker and the intellectual hubris which compelled the act. But this is certainly not because the social order of his world is any more moral than he is. Over the course of the narrative, Raskolnikov makes the acquaintance of a man named Marmeladov, an alcoholic who has squandered his family's money on booze. Marmeladov's daughter, Sonia, has become a prostitute in order to keep her family afloat. Marmeladov knows this and is racked by guilt and shame, which only drives him further into the abyss of alcoholism. Later on, Raskolnikov sees Marmeladov wander into the street in a drunken stupor. He is trampled by a horse-drawn carriage and mortally injured. Raskolnikov successfully drags the dying Marmeladov back to his family's apartment, and there Marmeladov dies in his daughter's arms, begging her forgiveness with his final breaths. The narrative of Crime and Punishment is, contrary to the worldviews of both Peterson and Nietzsche, definitively not one in which Raskolnikov's crime is a failure on his part to accord with the value hierarchy of wealth and power which structures the prevailing social order. Raskolnikov's failure is not a failure to get with the proverbial program and climb the societal pyramid under which he, Marmeladov, and Sonia have been crushed. Raskolnikov's crime, rather, is in his failure to realize that we must contend with this unjust world through the power of forgiveness, compassion, and sacrifice, rather than the resentment-fueled and intellectually rationalized vengeance which compelled him to murder the pawnbroker. Jordan Peterson has very often repeated some version or another of a maxim along the lines of, "Fix yourself before you try to fix the world." But if we look at the overall composition of Peterson's philosophy, it would seem that he doesn't really believe that the world really needs fixing at all. If we were to simply return to some liberal capitalist version of the Jovian power hierarchy, then all would be right in the kingdom, so it would seem. What Peterson doesn't seem to realize is that within the very cultural conditions for the possibility of liberal capitalism is an underlying Christian impulse, which is specifically oriented towards transforming that Jovian order into something radically different. The tension between Peterson's traditionalism and Christianity, which is emblematic of the tension between most forms of traditionalism and Christianity, lies in an inability to see that the Christic impulse is neither an affirmation of the Jovian order of hierarchical power, nor a resentment-fueled disavowal of life and bodily vitality. Rather, the Christic impulse is oriented specifically towards the realization of a new kind of order within both social organization as well as within the human spirit. This is an order within which the solar archetype, not the Jovian, is the metaphysical center of moral, valuative gravity, an order within which gnosis, theosis, and the affirmation of otherness allow for the many to become one, not through coercive control or through homogenization, but through a mutual, freely affirmed commitment to the realization of such solidarity. In Part 2 of Goethe's Faust, We see that Faust's endless quest to recreate the world through the supernatural power of Mephistopheles has only spiraled into ever greater scope and absurdity. Faust's journey has taken him across time, space, and the liminal veils between the worlds of matter and spirit. Faust has now come to serve as a favored administrator within a powerful kingdom, and he begins to use dams and dikes to push back the seas so as to reclaim the land beneath it and thereby to create a new realm which he can rule over. Yet, as usual, Faust's plans to realize his ambitions only create more death, destruction, and turmoil for those around him. Overcome by guilt and shame, Faust finally resolves to use his powers to create a better world for the subjects within his realm. In this moment of inner transformation, Faust finally experiences the state of pure bliss that he had wagered his soul against in his contract with Mephistopheles. In this moment of redemption, Faust loses his wager with Mephistopheles, but simultaneously Mephistopheles comes to lose his wager with God, in which Mephistopheles had proposed that he could lead Faust astray from the path of divinity. In the final scenes, various figures from the narrative, including those who had met their deaths due to Faust's misguided ploys, come to plead for Faust's soul, and ultimately he is led into the celestial afterlife. The development of rationality, individual freedom, and the power to master the natural world through science and technology is a process which is germinating the conditions for the possibility of a reborn world. The powers which we now wield are, much like the powers granted to Faust by Mephistopheles, powers with a higher purpose, which our civilization has almost entirely lost sight of in our quest for control and domination. How much longer we must wander in the desert is entirely up to us. It is entirely a matter of whether or not we can find the courage to be as radical as our souls demand that we be. Thanks for watching.